I pulled into the town well past midnight. The GPS had been my only companion for the last hour, guiding me through winding roads that seemed increasingly desolate. As the car's headlights cut through the darkness, they illuminated a town that looked like it had been forgotten by time. Buildings, some with peeling paint and boarded windows, lined the empty streets. Not a soul was in sight. I parked in front of the Airbnb, a quaint two-story house that stood out with its relatively well-kept facade. I remember thinking it was strange that a place so seemingly neglected could be listed online. The town had an eerie vibe, but I chalked it up to my late arrival and city-bred paranoia. As I retrieved my bag from the trunk, I glanced up and saw a light flickering in an upstairs window of the Airbnb. Must be a security measure, I muttered to myself. Or perhaps a previous guest had forgotten to turn it off. Either way, I was too tired to give it much thought. The key was under the mat, just as the host had instructed. The house creaked as I stepped inside, a sound that echoed in the hollow space. I flipped the switch near the door, and a dim light filled the entryway, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. I locked the door behind me, a habit from living in the city. As I explored the ground floor, checking the kitchen and the small living area, everything seemed in order. Old, but well maintained. I found a note from the host on the kitchen table, welcoming me and providing the Wi-Fi password. Standard stuff. The eerie quiet of the town was more pronounced inside the house. Every step I took seemed to be amplified, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I told myself it was just the fatigue talking. Making my way upstairs, I intended to find my room, unpack, and get some much-needed sleep. My work assignment in this remote town was going to be challenging enough without starting on the back foot. Little did I know, sleep would be the last thing I'd find in this house. Exhausted from the journey, I trudged up the narrow staircase to the second floor. The Airbnb's quaint charm did little to ease the sense of isolation that crept over me. I chose a bedroom at the end of the hallway, its window overlooking the deserted street. The room was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, and I hurriedly unpacked my bag for a sweater. Lying in the creaky bed, I tried to focus on the work that brought me here, but the silence of the house was unsettling. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a rural night. It felt heavy, like a blanket, smothering all sound. It started with a thud from the attic above. The sudden noise in the dead silence jolted me upright. Rationalizing it as the house settling, I tried to calm my racing heart. But then came the creaking floorboards, like the weight of someone moving stealthily. I strained my ears, wondering if I was imagining things. The footsteps grew more distinct, moving along the hallway outside my room. My mind raced with thoughts of the light I'd seen earlier. Was someone else in the house? I remembered then stories I'd heard at the last town about this place. Whispers of its dubious reputation. Stories of tourists going missing, of locals shunning this particular Airbnb. I had dismissed them as small town gossip. But now, trapped in the reality of these sounds, they felt ominously relevant. I sat up, gripping the edge of the bed. The footsteps stopped right outside my door, and I held my breath. After a moment that felt like an eternity, they moved on, fading into the distance. I waited, listening, but they didn't return. With a shaky exhale, I got out of bed and moved cautiously to the door. My hand hovered over the knob, a debate raging in my mind. The rational part of me wanted to check, to confirm it was just my imagination, but fear rooted me to the spot. After a long moment, I turned away from the door, deciding against opening it. Instead, I pushed a chair under the doorknob. A meager barricade, but something. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled in my stomach. The rest of the night was a blur of fitful sleep and startling awake at every small sound. When the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, it felt like a reprieve, but the fear of what the night had brought lingered, a foreboding shadow over what I had thought would be a simple work trip. Dawn's light brought little relief to my frayed nerves. The unsettling events of the night lingered in my mind, casting a shadow over the quaint room. I tried to convince myself it was all a product of my imagination, an overreaction to an unfamiliar place and the town's unsettling reputation. But as night fell again, my anxiety resurged. I double-checked the doors and windows, ensuring they were locked. The house was silent, almost oppressively so, as if waiting for something to shatter the calm. And it did. It started with a soft scratching at the front door, like someone was trying to pick the lock. I froze, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. Then, a sudden bang, as if someone had thrown their weight against the door. Panic surged through me. I rushed to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. The noise outside intensified, transforming into a cacophony of angry shouts and violent thuds. I could hear the intruder's voice, warped with rage, hurling threats and curses. I fumbled with my phone, hands shaking as I dialed 911. The operator's voice was a distant lifeline as I whispered my plight, the address spilling out in a frantic rush. The dispatcher's calm tone was a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding outside my door. The banging on my bedroom door began, each strike a hammer blow to my sanity. The wood creaked and groaned under the assault, a terrifying symphony that drowned out the dispatcher's assurances. I backed away, stumbling over a chair, my eyes fixed on the door as it shuddered in its frame. The intruder's voice was relentless, a barrage of threats and fury. I couldn't understand why they were so intent on getting to me, a stranger in this forsaken town. It felt personal, as if the intruder's rage was fueled by more than just the desire to harm. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise ceased. The silence was deafening, a void filled with my ragged breaths and pounding heart. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher, my gaze locked on the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. Minutes stretched like hours until the distant sound of sirens pierced the night. The police arrived, their presence surreal comfort in the aftermath of terror. They found no one, just the echoes of the night's horror etched into the battered door and my shaken soul. I learned later that the intruder had fled just before the police arrived, disappearing into the night like a ghost. The officers were sympathetic but not surprised. They spoke in hushed tones about similar incidents, a pattern of harassment that had plagued other tourists, tainting the town's reputation. As I sat in the back of the ambulance, wrapped in a blanket, the terror of the night replayed in my mind. I had come to this town for work, unaware of the nightmare that awaited me. And now, as I looked at the old Airbnb house bathed in the flashing lights of police cars, I knew I would never forget the terror of being hunted in a stranger's home. The morning after the attack was surreal. The Airbnb, once a quaint and quiet refuge, now felt like a crime scene. Police officers moved through the house, their voices a low murmur as they documented the aftermath of the night's terror. I sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sun rise over the town that had become my nightmare. The police chief, a stern but kind man, sat beside me, his presence both comforting and official. He explained that the intruder was known to them, a local with a grudge against outsiders. "He's part of the reason this town has such a bad reputation lately," the chief said, his voice tinged with regret. "We've been trying to catch him, but he's always one step ahead." The word reputation echoed in my mind. It was reputation that had led me to choose this Airbnb, its high ratings and charming description on the website. But those were a facade, masking the darker truth of this town, a truth that nearly cost me my life. I thought about the warning signs I ignored, the deserted streets, the flickering light in the window, the stories of the town's dubious past. It was a harsh lesson in trusting my instincts, in the reality that not all threats are as obvious as they seem. As I gave my statement to the police, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. I had survived, but not unscathed. The terror of that night would stay with me, a haunting reminder of my vulnerability. The police offered to escort me out of town, but I declined. I needed to leave this place on my own terms, to reclaim some semblance of control. As I drove away from the Airbnb, I took one last look in the rearview mirror. The house, now just a speck in the distance, represented a chapter of my life I was eager to close. I made a silent vow then, a promise to myself. Never again would I stay in an Airbnb. Never again would I ignore the signs. This experience had changed me, made me more cautious, more aware of the shadows that lurk beneath the surface of seemingly idyllic places. As the town disappeared behind me, I felt a mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that I was leaving it behind, and sorrow for those who might unknowingly walk into the same nightmare. My story was one of survival, but it was also a warning about the dangers that can hide behind a friendly facade, about the importance of reputation, and the reality that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones living right next door.